All right. Thank you all for joining us today for our session around preparing your data landscape for Copilot. This is session 2 of 3. We truly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to engage with Revanti. Revanti is a Microsoft partner that has a team packed with expertise in all things Microsoft. The team at Revanti is ready to help organizations deliver a more collaborative, more productive, and more secure experience. A few housekeeping items. This is a live event that is being recorded. We will be sharing the recording with each of you. If you have any questions on any of the content presented today, feel free to enter them into the chat and our team will take action to help answer them. Our speaker for today, Yasai, comes loaded with a deep wealth of knowledge around Microsoft's tools and its impact on end users. And I know for a fact, you will walk away with more insights on your data landscape with Microsoft's suite of tools by the time this is over. All right, enough from me. Yasai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate everybody taking time out of your day to be with us today. And part 2 of our webinar series. And today we'll be focusing a lot on protecting your data, preventing overexposure of your data, and really securing your data. In part 1 of our webinar series, we talked about securing our identities through Microsoft Entra ID. We talked about securing your devices through Microsoft Intune. And we also talked about securing your apps through Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. And today, we'll be focused heavily on how to protect your data and how to use the wealth of tools available in the Microsoft Purview family of products. So we'll be talking primarily about Purview and protecting your data, and we'll get into the important pillars when it comes to how to leverage and maximize Microsoft Purview. So here we look at all the different components and how important it is to make sure that your data is properly protected for a successful rollout of Copilot for Microsoft 365. So preventing overexposure of your data, protecting your data, and there's a lot of tools and capabilities available with Microsoft Purview that many organizations we find are underutilized. They don't properly have all these tools and mechanisms implemented and in place to really have a lock on your data. So it's very important that you have all of these in place prior to rollout of Copilot for Microsoft 365. And of course, today's session is fully dedicated on that data pillar. We find it's very important, and that's why we have a dedicated session to only cover data today. So now, Copilot for Microsoft 365 is built on the security and compliance principles, and that creates the foundations to promote responsible AI. That's very, very important. So it's built on top of your security, right? All the security, all the things that you have implemented and in place, it uses that and it's built on top of that. So it inherits that security that you create and configure to promote responsible AI. That's very, very important to understand because a lot of what we're talking about and a lot of what we're putting in place, the true purpose of it is to make sure that these are implemented so that Copilot can inherit that security that you implemented. We talked about, securing those identities, as I mentioned. We talked about securing the devices and your cloud apps. Now we're talking about securing that data. So all of that kind of build the foundation for responsible AI and for you to successfully roll out Copilot for Microsoft 365. Now, some of the statistics are very interesting, so I want to make sure I cover it. So 90% of organizations are multi-cloud organizations. That means that they use a combination of, Microsoft Cloud, of course. They use a combination of AWS, Google, GCP, Google Cloud Platform, and there's, it's common practice now that clients will be across different cloud environments. And, we've statistics show that 80% of decision makers have to purchase multiple products to meet their compliance and data protection needs. And, most of them find it really hard to manage. Imagine if you had to buy 2, 3, 4 different products to manage your data and compliance needs. It's very important. You have multiple teams, you have different team members that you want to promote these products to and to manage. So it becomes a challenge. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how you can maximize and really use the different capabilities that are available with Microsoft Purview. Now, there's a lot that comes with Microsoft Purview, and we'll be focused a lot on some of these items in today's conversation. There might be some that we, due to time, we won't be able to kind of get into, but some of the more important ones include information protection, include data loss prevention, include data lifecycle management. We'll kind of get into data connectors and insider risk management, and we'll also touch on e-discovery. We'll talk about compliance manager. I love that as well. That's another great piece, and I'll get into that in today's conversation as well, and how to use compliance manager to really do those assessments that a lot of times organizations have needed to bring in other legal counsel and other teams to kind of look at your data and to perform that assessment. Imagine being able to do that in an automated fashion through the tools that are available with Microsoft Purview. I think you'll find that very important and enticing as we progress. So I hope you're able to be around as we kind of continue that conversation. There's also additional items for data map and data cataloging. This is also for other data you might have. So Purview not only provides you protection and compliance capabilities for your data that's housed in Microsoft 365, but also for data that you have potentially outside of the Microsoft 365 realm. It'll also help you there as well. So, and we'll kind of get into that as well as we kind of progress on our conversation. So I'd like to first kind of mention some of the major important pillars for a successful rollout of Microsoft Purview. So look at all these items, and I wanted to kind of touch on these, right? So the first and most important one is really knowing your data. I think I find that that's been the biggest challenge in the real world is organizations really don't know their data. They don't know what they have. They might have performed the migration from, say, SharePoint on-prem or from a different environment. They might have migrated data and they don't necessarily know, hey, what data do I have? What type of sensitive data do I have? Where is that data, right? They don't know. What types of SharePoint sites do I have? Are they open to the public, as an example? Things like that. And the reason these are important is because, what we mentioned earlier is Copilot inherits all the security that you have implemented. So if you don't have anything implemented, that means that Copilot will just have access to everything. So that's why it's important for you to kind of remember that part and how it inherits that. And, that's the first and most important step is really knowing your data. Once you know your data, you know what you have, then you can apply the different protections and protect your data. And we'll talk about how to do that and how to actually protect your data using the Purview family of products. I will also get into preventing data loss, right? Once you have, know your data, you protect your data. Now, how do you prevent that data from leaving your organization, right? That's where preventing data loss using the DLP policies and configurations available is going to really help you on that next step. And finally, once you have your data, you know your data, you protect your data, and you have a way of preventing that data from leaving your org. Now you wanna govern your data. You want to be able to retain that data and delete data in certain cases, depending on your legal requirements, of course. So this kind of really encompasses the true path of your data, starting from knowing your data, protecting it, preventing data loss, and governing your data. And of course, we'll get into all of these areas and how you can perform these steps using the different products that are available. So I mentioned a lot about knowing your data. So data classification concepts are really important, right? So there are really key ways of knowing your data, right? So, and we'll kind of touch on these items. So there's things known as sensitive information types. These are things, examples are like your credit card numbers, driver's license numbers, social security numbers, things that are sensitive information types that are in your files and in your, in your data that you might not be aware of. So Microsoft Purview has tools and capabilities to kind of point that out and classify your data accordingly. There's also a great concept known as trainable classifiers, which don't necessarily use pattern matching, but as the name sounds, trainable classifier, I mean, you train it to give it examples of data, to tell it, okay, this is a positive example of the type of data that I want you to search, and this is a negative example. Things like invoices, as an example, things that might be sensitive to your organization, right? And we'll kind of get into that. And also knowing your data and what labels and how your data is labeled properly using sensitivity labels. And we're going to get into that as well. And also, knowing what policies are implemented, right? So these are all important concepts for really getting knowing your data and having kind of a nice hold of the data that you have within your Microsoft 365 space, of course, and across your other data sources as well. Now, it's a quick overview of data classification, right? So Content Explorer is one of the important tools, and we're going to kind of talk about that real shortly, and how to use Content Explorer to really organize and classify your data, right? It gives you, I really enjoy it because it really paints that picture of your data. You'll see how it takes all your data and really dissects that information and gives you a nice like little rows and organization of your data, especially in a lot of larger organizations. Maybe you have, most organizations, very common practice that you have a ton of data, right? And Content Explorer kind of really brings that all together, and we'll see that shortly. Activity Explorer is also a very good kind of component. Activity Explorer really shows you what's happening with your data, right? You want to understand, okay, I implemented all these sensitivity labels. I implemented all these things. Are they really being used? Are the labels being applied? What type of files are being changed and modified? I want to really understand that. So Activity Explorer will help you with that. We talked about, sensitive information types as well. I mentioned that in the just a minute ago or so, right? So sensitive information types really show you what type of information, and it's based on, again, confidence level, right? So naturally, Microsoft and Purview uses, machine learning to try to identify these patterns, right? So there's no 100% way for it to know whether or not, something is a credit card number. But with a certain level of confidence, it definitely can be really close and really provide you, high, and then there's different low, medium, and high confidence level where it could say, based on this pattern, I have a pretty high confidence that this is a credit card number, right? Things like that as an example, or SSN number or driver's license, because usually they follow a specific format, but, sometimes, people and users might be clever and might not necessarily format it properly. So sometimes that might skew those results, and we'll talk about that. And of course, trainable classifiers. This is where you train the system to look and identify content, but based on what it is, right? Not necessarily what's the elements of it, and based on specific patterns. So that's very important to kind of call out. So I was mentioning, Content Explorer, right? So here's an overview and kind of a nice screenshot to show you what Content Explorer really looks like. So I'm not sure if you've actually ever even looked at the Purview portal and the compliance portal, looked at this, but I think this is a very important, great way to start if you haven't. Look at the Content Explorer and really evaluate your data and understand, what is actually, how is my data currently organized, right? Look at the types of, if you have any sensitivity labels, if you have deployed it, and if you're already aware of sensitivity labels, if you've deployed it, you'll see which of your files are actually labeled across your organization. And then from there, you can look at what types of sensitive information types are within each of those files. Now, if you click on the actual file, it'll even show you how many instances of that sensitive information types. Like, as an example, there's one for Contoso Ignite, trip planning, right? So if you click on that, it'll show you, okay, within this document, I found this sensitive information types. With these, I found 2 instances that were medium confidence, one with low confidence, right? So you want to really look at the low confidence. These are, a lot of times they might be false positives, because low confidence means it's a specific pattern, as an example, but it's not necessarily sure that this could be a credit card number, because, it could just be a number string. credit card numbers will be usually 16 digits unless it's like Amex, right? They'll have, usually it starts with less numbers. I can't remember how many it was, but just kind of giving you one example, right? So higher confidence levels, if they put a Visa colon, if they put like dashes in there to format it properly, right? If they put, Visa dash and an expiration number and, and a 3-digit number on it, obviously that increases the confidence. So Microsoft, again, it applies this machine learning to really build that confidence. That's important for you to understand. So Content Explorer will really help you organize your data, and then you can drill down into the data itself, and it'll look at all the different Microsoft 365 locations like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams. It'll tell you exactly where that data is, right? So it really paints that picture for you, and I think if you haven't started to look at it, this is a great place to actually start. Activity Explorer, we mentioned Activity Explorer. This really will provide you the visibility into the activities that are happening on your data, right? On your documents, things like files being modified, renamed, right? If labels are being applied, you want to look at that to look at possible patterns, right? And we'll kind of get into this with Insider Risk Management shortly, but you want to see if there's any specific user who's doing some things in mass that you're not expecting, right? Somebody's going in there and renaming a lot of files or moving files, right? And labeling a bunch of files, or even worse, downgrading labels or removing labels. And, there's ways, of course, to prevent that. We'll talk about that when we kind of get into sensitivity labels and information protection. But, there's going to be a lot of that activity that you want to really identify and look at. And it'll give you a nice bar graph and kind of show you some of that. So I find Activity Explorer to be really powerful and kind of give you that insights that you possibly were not thinking of. Now, sensitive information types. I talked about it a few times. So there's different sets of sensitive information types. So of course, Microsoft has built in, over 300 plus, built-in sensitive information types. These are default patterns identified and managed by Microsoft. And these will include things like I mentioned, your credit card numbers, SSN numbers, driver's license numbers. It'll be other country drivers, like US driver's license numbers. It'll be, European driver's license numbers. They all follow a specific format, right, naturally. And Microsoft manages it. These are things that generally you can't edit. And they're built by Microsoft for you, right? So you don't have to really go and kind of reinvent the wheel and have to recreate it, right? And there's also custom sensitive information types where you can provide it specific patterns to look for. You can say, based on my organization, right, has specific patterns I want you to look for. There's also exact data match. So you can provide it exact values and tell the engine, a lot of this, as you can see, it's all programmed, right? You have the control to kind of really define what's sensitive for you, right? Because you might be an organization that overshares certain data because that's part of the industry you're in. So you might, a lot of these policies and sensitivity needs to fit your organization, or you might be a type of organization where you don't have any, and you don't expect to have any sensitive information type. So you might be alarmed when you see certain types of sensitive information. So it's very important that you have that control and that capability. And Microsoft helps you with that by managing certain components of it and providing you that, some of those options to move forward, but also giving you the granular control to control some of this, of course. So I talked about trainable classifiers as well. This is also really important in really knowing your data, right? Because these are different than sensitive information types, like I mentioned, which look at patterns, which look at like things, types of data, like look at example of a driver's license number, look at, okay, just start with this letter, have this many numbers, right? These are defined patterns that you give it that are sensitive. Trainable classifiers, you actually train it, right? You actually give it examples of what to look for, right? And there's a whole training process, and there are some built-in ones. And as you can see here, things like resume, source code, right? And if there's any, for HR, if there's any, profanity or, targeted harassment, things like that, right? That these are trained classifiers. These are things that Microsoft already trained on your behalf, and you can leverage that to see if those type of, information exists in your organization, or you can have your custom trainable classifiers. This is where, like I mentioned, you give it specific examples and files, and you tell it, look for these type of files, right? This is a good example, positive example, and this is a negative example. And then you could train it. There's a whole training process, that you can do to train the system to look for this type of file, right? To look for this type of information. And, it's not necessarily a pattern. It can be a whole, a type of file, and it analyzes that. You give it a few examples, and then the system, uses machine learning to say, okay, if I see this type of information in a different file and I can follow through and I know, okay, this is something that you defined as a client, I'll organize it accordingly, right? So all of this is in the realm, the Content Explorer, Activity Explorer, sensitive information types, trainable classifier. All of this really helps you really know your data, right? So you know exactly what you have within your data. So this really kind of is that first important pillar I mentioned, knowing your data, right? Now we'll get into, Microsoft information protection, right? We'll get into protecting your data. This is the second, really important portion of it. So one thing that's very, very important that I want to absolutely call out is Copilot will inherit the labels and protections you have in place against those documents. So as an example, if if I as a user, if I have specific labels on documents, right? And that document prevents me from seeing that. If I tell Copilot to provide me recommendations, it can only access files that I specifically have permission to. If there's a file that was protected with a specific label, and we'll talk about what that really means shortly. If it's protected by a specific label, then and I don't have access to it, if I tell Copilot to provide me a recommendation, it can't. So it's very important for you to understand that it inherits that information and protection capabilities that you, of course, put in place. So, we'll talk about how to apply that protection against your Microsoft 365 data. That's housed within SharePoint Online and OneDrive primarily, and of course also within Microsoft Teams, and also applying that protection in data in Microsoft, Exchange Online as well. So we'll kind of get into it and talk about that. Now, protecting your data, it's integrated, of course, across all the Microsoft 365 data, which again, it includes your SharePoint Online, includes OneDrive, Exchange Online, Teams, and of course, you can also kind of leverage and tap into your on-premise. There's Power BI, any non-Microsoft cloud and SaaS apps. Now, of course, some of the protection and capabilities will be limited for non-Microsoft 365 data. So depending on the application, there might be certain capabilities that it can or cannot provide. But of course, you can expand that and protect your data across the suite of where you have your data. But the end goal is to move. Most organizations, I find, they want to move their data to a unified location. This kind of makes sure that you have the proper protections in place where your data is housed, but sometimes that's obviously not feasible. You might have data in other locations, which is going to be common, right? So just know that there are some capabilities, then there are data connectors to kind of tap into the data in other areas where you have it, and of course provide protection. So again, you can use the Purview family of products to kind of provide that protection to that data. So information protection is, I can't stress the importance, obviously, enough of how important this is, right? There's quite a lot, right? Especially with the labeling and protection capabilities that are available. And encryption, of course, there's encryption capabilities with those sensitivity labels too. And we'll kind of get into what you can actually do with sensitivity labels as we kind of move ahead. I really absolutely love sensitivity labels, and I really want to spend, a couple minutes talking to you about how important it is to make sure that you use and apply proper labeling across all your files, across your SharePoint site, across Teams meetings. It's very important because it really brings that control and organization of your data and helps you really organize your data. So there's a lot of things that are available, and Microsoft 365 kind of allows you to have that encryption at rest, your files, and of course in transit and while it's in use. So you kind of have encryption across all levels. And there's also capabilities to provide like double key encryption for those really highly sensitive documents and files that you might have. So it's built into the Purview family of products. Back then, it required more AI, Azure Information Protection Agents, right? It was formerly called that. And you had more, it was harder to deploy. There was rights management service. There was like RMS, right? I'm talking back in the day, so I'm sure some of you might be aware of some of that terminology. So it was a little bit harder to roll out and protect your files. They've really streamlined it now. They really built into the Microsoft 365 app. So it's really easy to actually leverage and use this power, right? So it's important from an admin perspective, it's important that you implement these policies and implement these labels. But from an end user perspective, it's also important for users to adopt it. The easier it is for them to adopt and for them to see, oh, I can apply these labels. This is great. It's easy to do. It doesn't take too much time. The more you'll find people will adopt these security measures, because we all know, generally speaking, end users don't get overly excited for implementing added security, but from an admin and protecting your org, it's very important. So if we could ease some of those concerns by making it easier for them to adopt it, I find it's really powerful, and it makes the tool even brings more light to it, actually, right? So some of the basics of sensitivity labels. So one of the most important things of sensitivity labels is that it lives with the document. So I love the fact that that's built that way, because it really brings that power of what sensitivity labels are capable of doing, right? So once you apply that label to the document, so I'll give you an example. You create multiple types of labels, right? One of the labels is, say, an internal label. It's Contoso-internal as an example. And while you're creating that label, you actually specify that people in my organization have full access, as an example, to that document, and everybody else has no permission. So once that file is labeled, then that means only people internally who are authenticated, they open Microsoft 365 apps, and it'll be automated, right? They'll inherit once that file is labeled, they'll be able to open it and open it normally. Now, if they try to attach it or copy it somewhere else and send it, whether it's via email, we'll talk about how to protect the oversharing using data loss prevention. Well, let's say they were to copy that file and they try to open it with their personal account or on their personal machine, which they can't access, and you have conditional access policies as an example to prevent them from accessing their company data on their personal device. They might say, oh, I'll copy it on a flash drive and I'll open it on my own machine. That's great. They won't know, right? Well, if the sensitivity label, it lives with the document, they try to open it, they can't. So that's the important part and beauty of it. Now, it's really granular. You might have sensitivity labels that only grant, and I mentioned earlier, like how you want to, some of the data, even for your internal, you might want to lock down. So things like for HR, right? Things that are only certain individuals should see, you can create the labels to adopt to those standards, right? So you can protect your very important files using those permissioning. And once you permission them, then there's ways to automatically deploy. There's auto labeling capabilities where you can automatically label these content, right? And whether on the server side, on the client side, and you can also have policies that require all your files to have a label. Why that's important? Because knowing your data and really understanding what's what, I think it's very important to force that every file, in as much as once you deploy, of course, and once users adopt it, enforce a policy to require all documents to have a label, because it really will help you keep it organized, right? Now, how you'll achieve that, of course, is having labels that don't have any protection. As an example, they're just there to label items, and they'll kind of help you really organize your data. So, there's a lot that goes into it, but I want to kind of mention some of the key areas. You can, of course, use outside of encryption. You can use labels to add headers, footers, watermarks to your files. So you'll see how that's important. And, as I mentioned, it inherits it, and Copilot will inherit the protections again of that label. So if I can't see a document, then Copilot can't either, because I can't, because the label was assigned. And admins, you can control that through auto labeling policies, or you can publish these labels to allow users to add the labels themselves manually, right? So as I mentioned, encrypting and is one of the most important areas, but along with that is, applying markings, applying headers, footers, watermarks, and also there's different protections on files. And then you can also use sensitivity labels for your SharePoint sites, as an example, to control external and internal sharing. So if you have a label on a specific site, that will control whether that site can be externally shared, internally shared at different controls. You can also apply it to Teams, and that will control channel settings, right? And team settings, whether it's private, public. So you kind of control it on the top level. That's where the label, and plus you can view all of these and know, okay, I have this many teams with this label. So sometimes labeling is not necessarily always for the protection, but also to know your data and to understand labeled data. So it's very important that that's an important concept as well. It provides you that protection and also categorizing and labeling that, so that when you do view it from things like Content Explorer, as we saw with the sensitivity labels, you can see what labels are being leveraged where, and I think you'll find it being very important. And applying it, to promote secure collaboration with a Copilot for Microsoft 365. It's very important, and that's where it adheres to the security of those labels, right? As I mentioned, so it's important that these labels are published, and so that you don't necessarily roll out Copilot for Microsoft 365. You have all this data and you don't know what people can access. That's one of the biggest concerns we've heard from organizations is, I want to go live with Copilot for 365, right? I really want to go live, but I don't know what to do with my data. These tools and capabilities will really help you. And if these are implemented properly, and some, again, as I mentioned, you can automate some of this labeling, so you don't have to always depend on your end users to do it. You'll find that you will deploy and you'll have more confidence when you deploy Copilot for Microsoft 365. So I talked a lot about protecting your data. So the next step was preventing data loss. That's where you can use Purview data loss prevention, right? This is to automatically enforce, different policies based on specific criteria, based on specific sensitive information types, right? It's very flexible and granular. So you can really prevent your data from leaving the organization or even internally, right? To prevent data loss or overexposing your data. We talked a lot about that. That's where you use Purview data loss prevention policies to kind of protect you. And I'll also talk about, endpoint DLP, how you can do data loss prevention on the device level. I think that's that's an amazing feature that Microsoft really built in, and I'll talk about that again shortly. Now, preventing data loss, this is where you create policies through Purview, the data loss prevention policies, and you control what to actually enforce, right? You say, based on these document types, based on these sensitivity labels, if these files have these sensitivity labels, if it tries to leave the organization, prevent that from happening or block that action. You can also block actions of, and we'll talk about that shortly, blocking actions like protecting copy and paste, preventing them being copied on removable media, preventing them from being printed, right? All of these controls, the reason they're there is to allow you to not overexpose that data, right? And we talked about knowing protecting your data. You might ask yourself, well, I protected my data. Do I need to prevent it from leaving the org? Well, yeah, you kind of need to look at defense and depth. All of these conversations obviously are important to kind of understand that part, that you want to have multiple layers of security and defense. So this is, again, another layer of defense to prevent the data from, of course, leaving the organization. And it's really granularized and really gives you that control. So you can create the policies based on what you like. Now, my recommendation generally, especially if you're having block policies, I would recommend implementing policies at first in audit only mode. You don't want to create policies that might prevent your day-to-day. You might prevent your day-to-day operations. So you obviously don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you put these policies in audit only mode initially, and then once you see the activity, you see it's working as expected, then of course you go live accordingly. So it's very important, and I want to make sure I call that out. So this kind of depicts data loss prevention, and where to protect the data, the different rules you have in place. You can have multiple rules. They could be and or conditions, right? You say if this document, it's a docx file and it has this sensitivity labels and it has this condition or something along those lines, then perform this action, prevent it or audit only, or warn the user with the policy tip as an example, to really tell the user, hey, by the way, you're trying to do this. Are you really meaning to do this? Sometimes that's also powerful, right? You might not necessarily just inform, but even sometimes informing the user, I think you find that it's also really helpful, so that they're aware of kind of what's going on naturally. So, and I talked about, endpoint DLP. Endpoint DLP, so we talked about DLP policy. That's down on the Microsoft 365 level, right? Across your apps, you create policies. So if somebody goes and tries to email, right, or tries to go to Teams as an example, and copies a file, you prevent data loss prevention will kick in and block that action. Endpoint DLP, if you for any E5 customer, and endpoint DLP protects the end, provide DLP at the endpoint level. So while the user is moving around on their machine and on their device, as an example, if you have sensitive information types, right, and you have a file in your OneDrive as an example, and you try to copy that to a USB drive, right, you want to copy that to a network share or copy to a clipboard, the endpoint DLP kicks in and blocks that action. I really love this. I've adopted it in our organization. And it really brings a message that says, oh, you can't do this. As an example, somebody goes to just print, right? They're not necessarily like sending an email, they're not copying in Teams, but they're doing something on the endpoint level, right? It kicks in and says, okay, I'm going to block that activity. Again, it's based on how you configure it. You can also do things like blocking them from copying and pasting your sensitive data to like unknown sites or unknown cloud shares like box.com, dropbox.com, right? You could control it at the endpoint level. So if they try to do it or try to use an unapproved browser to copy it, they get a warning that this activity is blocked. Now, there's of course some prerequisites to put in place. It doesn't natively inherit these. The devices have to be onboarded to Defender for Endpoint. As an example, there's different extensions for the different browsers that need to be rolled out. But assuming all of that's in place, there's a lot of power in what you can do. And of course, you can put an audit only mode. You can warn what override, and of course, you can block it once you have it ready. So I would just from experience, just endpoint DLP, make sure if you do implement this or you do look to implement this, and if you do block any specific activity, really start at a lower level, meaning don't overly block, because what might happen is you might block day-to-day activity for the user and it might be overly aggressive. So audit only mode and starting with a pilot group is really helpful. People in IT or champions to really make sure that the tool is working to meet your needs. And then you obviously go with full on rollout. So data loss prevention, again, we kind of covered all of that, right? We really, all of these mechanisms are really in place to prevent, data from being overly exposed. Now, we talked about insider risk, right? I mentioned insider risk management earlier, right? So insider risk is really to understand that activity internally in your organization. It's really, for some organizations, you might not necessarily be aware, but you might have those risky users on your internal environment that might be doing things that they're not supposed to be doing, right? And you want to try to find a way to identify that. How do I know what my employees are actually doing, right? You might have illegal behavior occurring in your internal environment. Somebody who's doing things, and you can define what you consider risky activity. You can create that, and here you'll see, you create that policy and you define what are the types of risky activity I'm looking at. If somebody is, moving files to a specific SharePoint repository that's external only, as an example, and they're doing it in mass, you might ask yourself, why is that happening? Why is somebody moving it? And they might have the permission and they might take advantage of it. So insider risk is really to, again, in the realm of preventing data loss, you want to stop an activity in its tracks, right? If you don't have these insights and you don't have this information, right, and you can't see this, you can't know what's going on. So all of this is really to help you really prevent your data from being overly exposed. Because that internal employee or internal user might try to be, exposing that data outside. They might be doing some, activity that they shouldn't be doing. So creating insider risk management policies will help you, create that policy and then investigate and action it accordingly. So it's really powerful capabilities, again, built into the Microsoft Purview family of products. So really something to kind of really take advantage, to really understand and what's going on in my organization, especially for a large organization, or any size organizations. Really, there's a lot of power in what it can do, right? Now, the last pillar I mentioned is governing your data, right? You want to know and you want to automate, governing your data. How long do I want to retain my data? You want to ask yourself, well, how long do I want to keep my data? For how long do I need that data? Or when do I want to automatically delete data? You'll find it funny that, some for different organizations, different legal teams have very, varying policies, right? I've had organizations in the real world who've had a, believe it or not, a 90-day policy where they said, I want data to be only kept for 90 days and that's it. After 90 days, I want to make sure all my data is removed, right? And so, but you have organizations who have more different policies that want to retain data indefinitely. They want to keep that data for a longer period. You can adopt it based on your standards. And that's where you can use Purview Data Lifecycle Management to kind of classify and really create the retention policies to define how long you want to retain that data. So there's different ways, of course, of achieving this. And you can do this for your Microsoft 365 data and any non-Microsoft data, right? So why this is important in the realm of Copilot for Microsoft 365, because depending on how long you're governing and retaining your data, that will determine how long your end users obviously can search or access that content, right? When they're asking Copilot for recommendations, right? Depending on how long you're retaining your data, that's how far they can see, right? So depending on your policies, things like that. Now, in certain areas from email perspective, you might have policies that when employees, as an example, leave your organization, you might want to say, I want to retain data, as an example, for 5 years or 10 years or 2 years based on the item create date. So even if the user leaves and that mailbox and license, as an example, is removed, that mailbox remains as an inactive mailbox and you still retain that data. Now, we'll get into e-discovery hold as well. For anybody from legal on this call, they might ask, well, there's also, I want to be able to hold the data through e-discovery searches, right? So e-discovery holds are also available to hold that data in place, but retention policies are for situations where you have, policies created and to provide those capabilities on how long you want to retain or when you want to delete data. It's really granular in nature. So depending on what you want to do. So some orgs might say delete data after 90 days or delete data after 1 year or keep data for 2 years and then delete it after, or keep it for 1 year, but after that 1 year expires, just let it stay. But if a user deletes it, great, let it delete, but don't automatically delete it. So it's really granular and what you can do. And you can use it to protect your Microsoft 365 data and, of course, any non-Microsoft 365 data as well. So it's really powerful and really allows you to govern and control your data. So it's really important to identify that and to have the proper policies in place. And just to note, for customers who are on E5, there's also adaptive scopes, which static scopes, meaning you define what mailboxes get which policies, and you have to manually manage that and control that. Adaptive scopes will allow you to define different attributes. And based on that, they can be automatically added to different retention policies depending on their level, right? So you might have different policies for employees versus, more HR versus, or CEOs or leadership or managers might have different policies. It's really granular, and adaptive scopes really will control which policy they get added based on specific attributes and criteria that you define. So it's really important, really powerful. Let's also look at the Microsoft Purview AI Hub. This really gives you, so as you start adopting and using Copilot for Microsoft 365, you want to understand the activity. You want to understand the adaptability of Copilot for 365, understand the usage, right? and any risky activity. What type of content are people putting into? What type of things that they're asking, categories, things like that. What type of interactions are they having with Copilot, right? Things like that, or interactions on sensitive data that they don't have, things like that. So really understanding that usage and insights, right, is where the AI help. This is something new that Microsoft built into Purview, being that obviously with Copilot for 365. You want to understand, like I mentioned, what type of interactions our users are having and how many users are using it. So it's really powerful tools and capabilities that are built in. And it also has things, there's one section where you can create, it says, in order to properly deploy this, I would recommend these policies being implemented in place, and they usually implement it in audit-only mode. So it'll give you things like create this data loss prevention policy to look for these type of sensitive information types, and also create this insider risk policy. And it will leverage those policies, which again, it'll create an audit-only mode and provide you these insights and the charts to look at, the types of use and the types of interactions your users are having with, different, AI engines, right? So, and also if they're having interactions with possibly other AI tools out there. Now, if you have Defender for Cloud Apps, we talked about it in our first webinar, you could see and govern what type of AI tools you have allowed. And based off of that, you can see the types of interactions. And based on that, you can then take it back and say, okay, users are using, a different chat or chat GPT as an, I want to restrict that behavior. I'm going live with Copilot for 365. I don't want to allow Copilot use. Well, you can say unsanction that app using Defender for Cloud Apps and protect that from being used. So really powerful tools. Once everything kind of comes together, you see they're all kind of interconnected, of course, and intertwined with one another. So really important, something you want to look at for reporting and insights. Purview data connectors, I kind of touched on this. This allows you to connect to different data sources outside of Microsoft. Microsoft has a list of partners, obviously, that it has connectors configured, that you could create connectors for these data sources, right? Built-in connectors, like I mentioned. For other areas, maybe you're using Slack as an example, eDiscovery, Zoom meetings, WebEx, Twitter, or X as it's called now, or different areas of connectors that you're using, right? So it has different connectors for these locations, so you can extend your capabilities to those different areas naturally. And once you bring that data in, you can leverage the power of some of these policies and protect some of that data in these different locations. So, obviously some of the capabilities might be limited versus your Microsoft 365 data, but it's important to know that you can also have some capability to ingest non-Microsoft data and leverage the power of the Purview solution. So, if you were looking at using other tools as an example to protect that data, now you can use some of the Purview tools to protect that data. Compliance manager. This is also an amazing feature, right? Something very important. Some organizations have paid other, legal counsel or other people to bring in and say, hey, assess my data. Really tell me, do I meet these compliance assessment standards? Well, they'll have to say, okay, let me go through, let me look at your data, let me look at what you have, let me look at some of the sensitive information types. Oh, let me look at this assessment model. You need to make sure you have the A, B, and C configured. Now with Compliance Manager, it's all built in and automated. I mentioned when we initially started the webinar, I said, Compliance Manager, I kind of mentioned it. It has built-in assessments that you can leverage and say, this assessment requires you to have these compliance controls in place. And based on that, you have this score. So if you want to meet this assessment standard, make sure you implement these policies and you'll adhere to these. Now, it won't, of course, certify you naturally. It's not meant for kind of certification, but the Compliance Manager has tons and tons of different types of assessments and requirements. And you can leverage those assessments and really know, am I meeting these compliance standards? And if I'm not, what can I do to do that? It'll actually tell you what are the different capabilities you should implement. Oh, make sure you have DLP policies. Make sure you're looking for these types of sensitive information types, things like that. It'll tell you that if you create these, you'll meet these assessment standard. I find that really, really powerful. There's a lot you could do just with, Compliance Manager. If you haven't looked into it, really look into it. And, you can provide any legal teams you have access to this so they can perform these assessments without necessarily going and buying other tools. Let's buy another tool that can go in. Let's understand what this assessment is. The challenge might be you don't even know what included in the assessment. So Compliance Manager will really help you with that, of course. So, and also Purview eDiscovery. I mentioned eDiscovery. There's eDiscovery tools and capabilities available to, outside of, using retention policies to retain data. You could do eDiscovery searches against your data. You create eDiscovery cases based on specific criteria. So you might say, perform an eDiscovery search for a specific user, look for all their data as an example, and place it on hold, right? So you can use eDiscovery holds, you can create different cases. That tool is built in. There's eDiscovery Standard and Premium, depending on the license you have, but you can have, the important part is you can granularize. One thing I didn't mention I want to do is you can granularize these sets of areas by providing different permissions to different users. So you might provide eDiscovery tool capabilities to specific team members from legal, as an example, who could perform these eDiscovery search as needed, built into the solution without needing another product that say, oh, I need another product to do eDiscovery search. It's built in, you can use it, you can do eDiscovery holds, and so it's really powerful and kind of brings that control. So, and now, so now we have all of these capabilities in place. You can use all of these Purview family of products to really, know your data, to protect your data, to prevent data loss, and govern your data. And all these tools and capabilities are there for you to perform that. So, and that concludes our session, webinar 2, part 2 of our webinar series. So I want to really thank everybody for your time. It was a pleasure. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope this session really brought to light all the tools and capabilities available with the Purview family of products to really protect your data. Knowing and protecting your data, governing your data, and preventing that data loss. These are very important areas for a successful rollout of Copilot for Microsoft 365. So I really appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
So thanks, Isai. You know what? We actually did have 2 questions come in. Okay, yeah. So you talked about information protection and protecting your data. And you brought up data loss prevention, DLP, to prevent data loss. Do I really need to have both in place? If I just protect my data, is that sufficient for me? Make sure my data is secure.
That's a great question. So yes, it's absolutely. So you might, that's a definitely great question. So the question was, if I have, say, information protection in place and I protected my data, do I need data loss? Or if I have data loss, which I'm protecting my data from leaving the organization, do I need to protect that file? And the question is, yes, you absolutely need to have both of them in place, because look at the concept of defense in depth and what that provides, right? You want to have multiple barriers of protection. If you only have protections in place to prevent the data from leaving your organization, right, then you don't protect the data. What happens if somebody finds a way to get your data out, right? So that means that file and data is not protected, right? So you want to always have multiple lines of defense to protect the data. And in reverse, let's say you don't have DLP policy. You say, hey, I protected my data. That's great. Why do I need DLP? The file's protected. It's okay if they send it out to somebody. They can't open it anyway. Well, you always want to have the multiple layers of defense. So you want to protect your data and also have DLP policies to prevent it from leaving the organization. So always kind of think of it in that way. Always having multiple layers of defense is very important. Have the most secure environment, because you never want to have a single layer of protection. You want to always have, think about that defense and that concept. And I think it will really help you as you're thinking about and strategizing across your Microsoft 365 stack. It's very important to kind of think in that realm.
So this question is more about securing identities, then devices, securing our data, which I think we covered in the first one, identities and devices, but today data is kind of the focus here. But do I need to do them all at the same time?
Definitely great question. So think about just your Microsoft 365 landscape and all the different vectors, right? So what we found and what statistics show is that you want to protect all your pillars, right? You want to have a control across all the important pillars because these are all possible areas that bad actors, that things can be exposed, right? We talked in the webinar in the part one about protecting your identities, all the different ways to use different policies to protect your identities, the different types of authentication policies, MFA, conditional access, the risky users, right? This really provides you protection at the identity level. So you know and control your users and your identity base. We talked about protecting your devices through endpoint and make sure that your endpoints are protected, whether that's your Windows devices, that's your mobile devices, your Mac devices, right? Having that protection there and protecting your cloud apps as well, what apps people are connecting to, and having app protection policies to control your company data. We talked about a lot about that. And today we talked about protecting your data, right? And really having the protection on the data itself. So this is all in the line of defense and depth. You're kind of protecting data at all angles, just in case if one for some reason gets exposed, if a user's identity gets exposed or something happens there, you at least have your data protected. You have the endpoint protected to make sure that bad actor can't get far because they got it, somehow they got to the user's account, they're trying to do some sort of activity that they shouldn't be doing. Policies in Defender for Endpoint can protect it. Oh, they're trying to do an activity that they shouldn't be doing. Well, then data, some of the data loss prevention and some of the things we talked about today will protect them. So really thinking in the realm of defense and depth is why it's important to always think that you have all of these policies in place are going to be important. You don't necessarily have to deploy them all at once, all at one time, because it does take time to kind of configure all of these things, but some of them can happen in parallel. So to answer the question, do they all have to happen at the same time? Not necessarily always all at the same time, but in a layered approach, generally speaking. But you want to make sure that you cover all of these pillars, because if you leave one out, you're going to potentially leave yourself exposed to outside threats. And it's really important, if you have these tools and capabilities, what we want to bring to light is that you have all these capabilities, you made all these investments with Microsoft, maximize and you really leverage all these tools because Microsoft really built all of these in for you to protect your organization. So it'll help you maximize it and use a single set of tools to manage all of these.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. There was a lot of content to get through, and this is just the beginning. Please join us for the last and final session on September 12th. And don't forget, Revanti is always here for when you and your organization is looking for a deeper dive or more specific use cases of Microsoft's capabilities. Thank you and have a great rest of your day. See you next week.